Hey everyone, I'm just adding a quick note to the beginning here that, as you can probably tell, this video was meant to come out a lot sooner than it is, and was actually written under a very different climate than what we're under now. And you may imagine that with Trump's second impending presidency, that a lot of this kind of stuff might be rendered irrelevant by this point. So that's kind of why I wanted to stress that actually, if anything, the ideas I go into here have only become more important. So in a desperate effort to retroactively recontextualize a lot of this, the point of this video is simply to explore how we as leftists should go about and pursue direct action, just through the lens of student protests. It should be obvious why this is going to be more important moving forward, so I hope you enjoy the video and I hope you have a happy new year. The summer of 2024 was kicked off with some of the most exciting and prominent student movements in decades. Spreading from Columbia University, encampments and occupations occurred across almost the entire world in solidarity with Gaza. Seeing students take over buildings, distribute radical material, and clash head-on with police have naturally evoked the image of 1968, where the very same university these movements started from today, Columbia, also saw an occupation protesting an ongoing war. And of course, in Paris, where student movements surged in such strength alongside worker strikes as to cause the president at the time to flee the country. Today then, I want to talk about the student protests we've seen recently, try to understand what revolutionary potential existed, if any, and carve out what the communist role in these movements could have been. I believe these recent occupations contain all of the elements necessary for us to understand the potential of radical action even beyond student movements, as well as how it develops and what steps we can take ourselves to help it go further and achieve more in the future. As always with these types of sudden surges in action, we need to start by asking why they came about. At the start of this year, I posted a video speculating that we were entering a new period that was ripe for new forms of radical action due to people's deepening disenfranchisement with electoral politics over Gaza, and advocated for explicitly fostering the sentiment against Biden and the effectiveness of voting in general in order to steer people towards more radical forms of action and thinking. This was not well received by much of the online left.
This is revolutionary pseudo-speak. It's duck speak. It doesn't mean anything. See, I don't know what else is possible. Like, I don't know what direct action means. There aren't going to be any big, magical revolutionary actions. There never will be any big, radical revolutionary actions. It's always been dirt. We live in dirt.
There was a lot of skepticism around what direct action even meant and what was possible to be done. I think it's reasonable to say, though, that the outburst of occupations and encampments have thoroughly dispelled this skepticism. The occupations made it clearer than ever that people are desperate for some way to effect change over Gaza, and I think we really need to take a moment to let it sink in the conviction with which so many of these students acted, willingly risking their whole careers to make their demands. One moment that really touched me in particular was the resistance of the UCLA encampment, where, after the riot police had begun their full-scale raid of the campus, following a full night of launching flashbangs and shooting rubber bullets at protesters, it was clear the encampment was inevitably going to be dismantled. Yet despite this, even into the next morning, students continued to link arms and make cops fight for every inch of ground until the bitter end. I can think of nothing better to reflect the growing radicalism among people who care about these issues. Of course, not everything was such a bittersweet ending. We have also seen concessions from these movements too, with multiple universities across the world having now divested from Israel. Overall then, this was not only an inspiring display of radicalism and a glimpse of further potential, but also actual material gains too. Seeing such an explosion of action in the face of the skepticism shared by much of the left, of course merits some reflection too. In retrospect, it's easy to wonder how anyone could be so cynical about the possibility of new waves of radical action, but I think this is once again a demonstration of the point that, right up until these things happen, their potential always feels vague and difficult to articulate. Even I wasn't able to predict a spike in student protests specifically when I made my video. But that's kind of the point. Like I've said before, people who suddenly take up radical action will turn up as just another Dem voter in the statistics one week, and then brawl with the police and set fire to their stations the next. People can very suddenly and very dramatically shift political activity in response to unique conditions, and again, the conditions over Gaza and the generalized dissent towards the existing government is certainly unique, opening up all sorts of new opportunities. I can only hope then many of the leftists who could only muster apathy and skepticism towards attempts to conceptualize these opportunities are now able to recognize these patterns in the future. Returning to the occupations themselves though, again, there's a lot to be happy about. They've been largely successful in achieving their goals. They've demonstrated that we still have power if we're willing to take it, and even where they were brutally shut down, they've only stoked more disillusion with the existing government and the power structures of the state in general. Like 2020, it shows the left's radical potential is continuing to rise. However, we're communists, so we still need to ask, could this have gone further? And if so, why didn't it? And most importantly, what should we be doing next time to make it go further? Like I said, when thinking about student protests, the biggest instance of seizing power are the May 68 movements. So to understand the potential of student occupations today, let's overview what they've achieved in the past. The student movements of 1968 hold a lot of parallels to today, in that they were also born out of an anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, and spilled over into many ongoing domestic issues too. The 68 student occupations at Columbia started over Vietnam, but then went on to incorporate demands against gentrification of neighborhoods like Harlem, and ending the university's ongoing military research projects with the CIA. The occupations were also ended through excessive force by the NYPD, but in the case of 68, this sparked teacher strikes and protests from surrounding neighborhoods, which eventually led to the majority of demands being won. By far and away though, the most significant cases of student protests were in Paris. Here, the same style of student occupations sparked a series of protests, riots, and worker strikes which brought the French economy to a standstill. More than this though, what took place inside the occupations, involving students and workers alike, represented the forefront of political consciousness of the whole movement. On the 3rd of May, students occupied Sorbonne University, demanding divestment from the Vietnam War. These occupations were again crushed with brutal police repression. Immediately following this though, protests and prolonged clashes with the police took place. Only 3 days later, the student protesters were building street barricades in the Latin Quarter of Paris. Fighting and protests continued to escalate over the coming days, sparking calls for sympathy strikes in various factories. This eventually culminated on the 13th of May, with demonstrations over 500,000 people strong in Paris alone, and strikes across multiple sectors of industry. From this point, the real force of May 68 was unleashed, with a chain reaction of strikes propagating across the entire country. Much of the driving force of further worker movements from this point on was less rooted in the events of the original student movement, but it's clear that the student occupations are what set off the chain of events that shut down the whole economy. The role of student movements historically has not been simply confined to triggering further action outside of universities though. What was so special about Paris was what took place inside the universities after they had been occupied. Many of the factory strikes that gripped France were not revolutionary in character. They were largely only bartering for better worker conditions or higher wages, either due to co-option by self-interested union leaders or simple worker apathy. The university occupations, however, were actively interested in establishing a new society, and this extended not just as an ideological position, but how the universities were transformed during their occupation. Two professors participating in the occupation of the Censure Center of the University of Paris wrote an essay titled Worker-Student Action Committees, which emphasizes the communal nature of this occupation. What is even more important is that students did not take over the universities. At the Sorbonne, at Censure, at Nanterre, and elsewhere, the university was proclaimed social property. The occupied buildings became ex-universities. The buildings were opened to the entire society, to students, teachers, workers, to anyone who wanted to come in. Furthermore, the ex-universities were run by their occupants, whether or not they were students, workers, townspeople. At Censure, in fact, the majority of the occupants were not students. This socialization was accompanied by a breakdown of the division of labor, the division between intellectuals and workers. In other words, the occupation represented an abolition of the university as a specialized institution restricted to a special layer of society, students. The ex-university becomes socialized, public, open to everyone. The university here wasn't the stage of a political struggle, it was truly transformed into a place of communal living. Students were among those who cooked and cleaned, workers were among those who discussed and debated, and life was organized organically without any ruling authority. The campus was not held as a bargaining chip, but used as the base for a new way of living. What we can say about the student movements here then is that though they may not have represented the center of power or owned any critical infrastructure, they did cultivate the most advanced consciousness of the movement. The next step for the students of 68 then would be to spread this perspective outside of the universities and into the factories where it mattered most. The goal was to have workers take inspiration from the students and recognize their factories too for the social property they really were, transforming their strikes into genuine efforts to build a new society. In the pursuit of this goal, the Sensia Center set up worker-student action committees, groups of students who made efforts to reach out to striking workers in numerous ways, from aiding their strikes with numbers and supplies, to discussing and spreading pamphlets with radical ideas, to inviting workers to the university to further coordinate. One area in particular the action committees were able to contribute well to was bringing in the involvement of many more migrant workers to the strikes than the unions were able, who are otherwise less aware of the labour disputes, more fearful of punishment than native workers, and in many cases didn't even speak French. For instance, students travelled to migrant living quarters with translators, offered transportation to the factories to join the occupations, and even began running French lessons at the university. However, the students quickly ran into a problem. In one case, at the Citroën plant, students had spent a whole day integrating a large group of migrant workers into the factory occupation on behalf of the union. The next morning, they arrived at the gates to find them locked, and told by union officials they were not welcome, and were not allowed to direct communication with any of the occupying workers, with the excuse that they wanted to avoid outside agitation. Union leaders were scared of students redirecting the aims of the workers away from reforms and towards revolutionary goals, as this would undermine their power over the strikes. After all, a society without class struggle has no need for unions at all. Students having to fight through union bureaucrats just to get in contact with workers unfortunately became a recurring theme throughout the strikes. While there were workplaces which were very receptive to the radical message of the students and became heavily involved in meetings at the university occupations, overall the students failed to direct the broader movement towards radicalism. Again, union bureaucracy was a large reason, but a full analysis of why France 68 didn't produce a revolution despite very much being capable involves a whole corpus of work that I personally have only just begun trying to get to grips with. However, even without solving this question, this still tells us a lot more about what student movements are capable of. Again, in a nation gripped by strikes, universities were the center of truly radical ideas that sought to undo capitalism at its roots, providing a living example of the kind of world that was possible. So, returning to the recent wave of student movements and the question of how far they could have gone, there seems to be two dimensions. Firstly, along what action could have been carried out, encouraged and inspired internally and externally, and second, as their role as a center of revolutionary thought that seeks to spread radical ideas. As far as how much action the movements carried out, i.e. how many buildings they occupied and how much disruption they caused, this is where they are clearly already the strongest and, for me at least, inspire the most hope. This latest movement has codified the new climate which 2020 ushered in, where animosity towards the police is a given, and where activists gravitate towards confrontation over coexistence. For instance, the occupations started picking up the most steam when clips began circulating of students locked in clashes with cops, demonstrating a naive administration attempting to quickly put an end to what they saw as merely a nuisance, but to their surprise, finding a group of dedicated activists prepared to stand their ground and fight back at whatever was thrown at them. I think this is the distinguishing feature between these recent movements and other contemporary ones they've been compared to, such as Occupy. In 2010, People were still content to sit and take it when the police indiscriminately pepper sprayed peaceful protesters. But today they're no longer satisfied with just having their message heard and taking the high ground. Furthermore, and most vitally, the goal has shifted from just making oneself heard to actually causing disruption in order to win concrete demands. The aims of the most developed occupations were shutting down the daily functions of their universities in order to place real stress on the administration, and this worked. Either concessions were won, or the administration resorted to exerting yet more force, and in the process legitimizing the claims of the protesters and driving more people to their side. However, in the cases where student movements were crushed with proportionately gluttonous levels of force, most notably New York, LA and Berlin, they didn't spark the sympathy movements that were needed to progress the movement. No doubt many people were further radicalized by these scenes, the disgust was palpable, but unlike the movements of '68, the action ended with the students. This leads us into the real limiting factor of the recent protests, which is that they were largely isolated in the political landscape. There's no active labour movement by which the students could appeal to in any of these places, and so the potential for such occupations to boil over into generalised action is, currently at least, somewhat hamstrung. That doesn't make them not worthwhile though. Like I said, the events of 2020 had set the stage for the movements today, and likewise these too will have pushed the boundaries of what people previously imagined was possible. This is how radical movements develop. What we as radicals want is for these boundaries to continue to expand, to eventually put us once again in the position where local action can trigger generalized action. To contribute to this though, to develop the broader movement and spark broader action, it's vital to understand what made these movements today go so far and how to help them go even further next time, such as to inspire others through demonstrating the wins that are possible with taking power into our own hands, or through forcing the state to once again drop the fascade and bare its teeth in response. Pursuing this comes down entirely to one word: escalation. The student occupations were no exception. Their survival was predicated on the continual expansion of the occupation to maintain momentum in taking more space and not becoming contained to any form of action administrators were able to control and adapt to. Again, contrasting to Occupy, the goal was not to make a scene, but to bring everything to a halt until the demands were met. And this means not just catching out power the first time, but every subsequent time that it tries to adapt to you. As the most radical elements in a movement, it's the task of us, the communists, to engender this way of thinking. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously those who started the biggest occupations, in New York, LA, Berlin and elsewhere, already grasped this and were perfectly radical without anyone's help. But not every occupation went as far as they did. Many were perfectly happy to have a corner of a campus green allocated to them and wait patiently. Many were all too eager to negotiate with administration before they had any leverage, and worse still, actually trust anything they were told. And many were simply scared of taking things too far. But even in the most radical movements, with escalation comes growth, and with growth comes the introduction of new and conflicting elements. And so, as well as encouraging a radical perspective, it's also necessary to combat emerging regressive ones. For example, the Columbia encampment was so successful, it started attracting visits from Democratic politicians to show support, most notably Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whose involvement sparked debates both online and on the ground about whether she ought to be welcomed at the encampment. There were many who were upset with her failure to condemn Biden over his involvement in the genocide, which since turned to a full endorsement, but also those who wanted to embrace her involvement as a sign that the movement was gaining real recognition and real power. In this case, it was these people, and the politicians they bring in, who are the elements setting the stage for the ever-recurring problem of protest movements, liberal co-option. This is often imagined as a conspiratorial thing, like a secret plan to disarm the left when it gains too much power, and while there are times when this is absolutely true, it's not always so nefarious. Most of the time, it comes out of competing ideas of why we're actually out in the streets to begin with. For many leftists, direct action only exists as a means to win concessions, and in this case aren't so different from voting for a left-wing candidate. They're just another tool in the box to achieve the same reforms. Many of these leftists aren't opposed to direct action that even goes as far as riots, but if these actions fail to win the ear of any politicians, then, in their view, they were effectively pointless. This is why when politicians like AOC make an appearance, these people rally around them and try to shift the current movement to appeal to them. Even the antagonistic case of trying to pressure a politician still follows these same lines. In contrast, as I've explained, when we're concerned with building radicalism, the reason these actions matter is because they develop the broader movement and make bigger, stronger action in the future more likely, with the ultimate goal, of course, of undoing the roots of current society altogether. As such, and not just because it's the best way to win demands, we want these movements to continually escalate, as well as spark further external action, i.e. explicitly call for continued, rebellious, illegal activity. By their nature though, politicians can't encourage this. Obviously AOC cannot, without jeopardizing her career, call for the encampment to seize more property, for the surrounding community to pour in to help fight off the cops, and for the supermarkets to be looted to supply the protesters. Instead, she operates with a completely different framework of what power is and how change is achieved, and she can only offer something to the movement when it transforms itself into being compatible to that same mode of power. This is where co-option happens. Concern shifts to matter internal to the existing system, passing policy, appealing to voters, gaining influence, and power ceases to be drawn from its initial ability to bypass these systems. To make itself palatable, the movement is cleaved into the good and the bad, the violent and the peaceful, the pragmatic and the idealistic, such that these politicians can endorse what is safe and discard what would threaten them. Energy is captured and redirected back into existing structures of power where, stripped of what brought it into life to begin with, it quickly dies. Despite what policy reforms might be won by this point, the potential for further escalation has been gutted, and so this reveals the fundamental opposition between the radical and electoral approach. The do both narrative collapses into different ways of doing the same thing. By this point, we can see another parallel emerge between the modern student movements and the movements of the 60s. While today the moderating elements take the form of electoralists, previously it was through the unions. It was the unions and the workers aligned with them who, rather than harnessing the potential of their current moment to construct a new society, wanted to trade in their radical elements for concessions within existing society. This reveals that the problem of co-option is not tied to electoralism exclusively, but any reformist entity. More interesting still, the fact that this problem still existed back in '68, when total power was very much in reach, reveals that this conflict between reform and revolution is not really based on how realistic either approach is, but rather an inability, or straight unwillingness, to conceive of revolutionary change to begin with. Those stuck in a reformist mindset will continue to drag us back into a moderated capitalism even when victory is right in front of them. And so, how do we effectively combat these reactionary elements in our movements? Again, the total denunciation of voting I argued for in my last video, which has only become more pertinent as blue states have cracked peaceful students' skulls, is an important example, as to rule out cohabitation with these moderating forces. But the official strategy we declare is the bare minimum. Far more important is the real nature of the movement itself and the activities it partakes in. Ideally, we would create a movement which itself acts as a radicalizing force for those who engage with it. This is precisely what the students of Paris were able to achieve in transforming their universities into social spaces, i.e. beyond the passive occupations seen in the factories into active occupations which facilitated a new way of living and thinking. Those within the university, in the surrounding communities which the campus was opened up to, and the few striking workers who the students were able to connect with, were not convinced of any radical ideas by just having arguments presented to them, but discovered radicalism by interacting with this communal environment. The occupation organically produced people who resisted their newfound power being appropriated away from them, be it through parties or unions. This is what future radical movements must strive towards, using occupations as an opportunity to experiment with new ways of living. Compared to the movements of 68 along this dimension, the recent student movements fall considerably shorter, likely because even the idea of a new society is still so far from anybody's minds, which itself can be linked back to the surrounding political climate that prevented further escalations we discussed before. But it's vital for occupations to take on this character regardless of the surrounding context and how likely it actually is they're about to usher in a new world. For all movements, students or otherwise, we must encourage the radical perspective which declares for whatever space is taken, of whatever size and for however long, that it has been teared out of the existing social fabric and transformed into something new. Interestingly, this seemed to already happen organically in the less directed movements of the George Floyd riots, where we saw not just the infamous Chaz, but also George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, and not from student radicals, but regular people. As one of the largest mass seizures of power to take place in recent history without demands being made of any higher power, all there was to do by those on the ground was carve out the streets as their own and distribute looted food and supplies among themselves, while recreating the space in their own image and for their own needs. I would really love to do a deep dive into these occupations and of course talk about the problems of Chaz, but this will have to be for another time. For now, what's important is that this goes to show people are very much capable of engaging in these types of active occupations without communism needing to be intimate. Overall though, we've been able to use these student movements to extrapolate a rough set of guidelines for effective direct action, and how to further our goals as communists specifically. Far more than any specific demand, the most important part of radical movements is to expand the wider consciousness of what's possible such that more action can follow, which means direct action must continually push along the axis of radicalism, continuing to escalate until it either wins its demands or exposes for everyone the real nature of the state as fundamentally hostile and unsalvageable. Furthermore, as the most radical element in a rapidly expanding movement, it is our job to continue fostering the attitude necessary to perform this escalation and prevent moderating forces from derailing the movement's potential, which today translates into an explicitly anti-electoral position. Lastly, in order to maintain and perpetuate the radical attitude of these movements, we must strive to create internally radical character, which aims to separate itself from existing society at any given opportunity and transform whatever space it takes into a garden of radical ways of living, and as a result into a vehicle of further radicalization.